I'm Charlotte.
And I'm Dina. Welcome to the Grim Curriculum.
Hello, hello. We have something a little bit different for you today. It is Grim Encounters number 5.
Can you believe it's the 5th time we've done this?
Honestly, I know we say this every time. We're creatures of habit and repeating ourselves, but they are some of my favorite episodes, and today's is even a little bit different to our usual Grim Encounters, so I'm very excited.
I love doing these episodes, and I have to say, I also love the No Sleep subreddit. I've spent a lot of time reading those posts.
Yes. Oh my god, so good.
And the ones on Let's Not Meet. I love them. They're fun. You get to enjoy the work of some really talented people, and I'm really excited that today we are going to share some of those with you.
So, a bunch of you told us that you enjoyed us reading the Alfred Packer confessions and, of course, the iconic, very long judge sentencing report, which is wild because apparently you guys love to hear us read. So, if you are one of those people, I guess this episode is a special for you.
That's right. We have 3 stories for you all today. We usually take a more nonfiction approach to these, but this time it's a little different.
We have 2 amazing authors who have allowed us to share their work. We are going to be throwing them up all across the social medias and, of course, in the show notes and the description. And we encourage you guys to go find them and show them a ton of love.
We are busy behind the scenes working on our big series for episode 100, so getting to tell these scary tales gives us a little bit of extra time for research and writing, which we really appreciate.
Yes, because we think you're all going to be very excited when you find out what the big topic is.
All right, are you ready for these?
I am so ready. So, everybody, this is your time to grab a blankie, a hot cocoa, or maybe a furry friend. And that means animals or your friend who is a furry. We do not judge. Anyway, you're going to need someone to hug, so brace yourself.
Yeah, close your eyes and let your imagination take you away.
Unless you're listening to this while driving, which obviously use some common sense, guys.
Yeah, don't do that. First and foremost, we want to give a huge shout out and thank you to Manon_Lyset on Reddit for letting us use some of their stories for this episode. And again, they are going to be in the link description.
You probably all know very well by now that the both of us absolutely love anything to do with the ocean, whether it's scary or fascinating. So this story is extra special for us both.
This is from their submission on No Sleep, and the title of the post is, "If you see a searchlight too soon after capsizing in the North Pacific Ocean, hide." A few years ago, I was working as a deckhand on an Alaskan fishing boat. From a young age, my parents instilled in me a strong work ethic. They always said hard work leads to greater returns, so I naturally gravitated towards a career that shared that philosophy. Alaskan fishing added high risk to the equation, and in turn, the rewards were even sweeter. I couldn't imagine doing anything else and planned on working my way up to captain one day. This story takes place during my 5th crabbing season. By then, I knew the ropes, I was familiar with the waters, and I'd witnessed a few deaths firsthand. I thought I was prepared for anything. I was dead wrong. We were a crew of 15, myself included, when the season began. That number would be halved by the time we returned to shore, and I would be left incapable of setting foot anywhere near the ocean ever again.
I already love how this is starting. Amazing.
I got goosebumps.
I was sailing on the Seaward Sarah, a vessel that was getting a little long in the tooth, but was known for her reliability. Since she'd passed her safety inspection earlier that year, I had no concerns as we left port for the cold waters of the North Pacific Ocean. It was exhilarating to be on the sea again, with the fresh, salty breeze and waters so vast you couldn't see anything but blue for miles around. Spirits were high, and the excitement of starting off on a journey was electric. We always hold a party for the first and last nights. It was tradition. Even the captain would join in and dance and sing and drink. We noticed the first sign of trouble 2 days into the journey. The Seaward Sarah was listing on her starboard side. It wasn't at a dangerous angle, and after consulting the ship's engineer, the captain determined that it was safe to proceed farther into the North Pacific Ocean. He planned on balancing her out once we started loading crabs onto the cargo decks. We'll overfill the port cargo and underfill the starboard. I didn't question the plan. It seemed reasonable, and besides, I was just a deckhand. The captain could piss in the my The captain could piss in my mouth, tell me it was wine, and I'd smile and agree. That's just the way it works at sea.
I grew more concerned as the voyage went on. The list worsened over the course of the next week. It went from a barely noticeable incline to my calves burning from straining against the pull of gravity towards starboard. That's when the captain started making a lot of calls. I couldn't hear what was going on, but I could see him shouting into the receiver, his face getting redder and angrier as the days wore on. I was told he was cursing everyone, from the ship's manufacturer to the inspectors to the contractors who'd last done repair work on her hull. I was told it was business as usual. One evening, when most of us were gathered in the dining hall, holding our plates and glasses to keep them from sliding around the table, the captain burst in and announced that we were turning around. Our reactions were mixed, with some experiencing relief and others disappointment. No one knew what this meant for our wages or whether the repairs could be done in time to get back to sea before the end of crab season. Me, I was one of the ones who was relieved by the news. The vast ocean I'd been yearning for months had become progressively more unsettling as the ship tilted. I became keenly aware just how far away I was from dry land, from safety. This place I found freeing suddenly felt like a cage, and I wanted out. I felt the seaward Sarah turn as I headed back to the crew quarters and used the wall for support. The combination of the dime turn and the ship's tilt were terrible for my equilibrium. I needed to lay down and let myself adjust.
I don't know what would have happened if the storm hadn't hit later that night. Would the seaward Sarah have limped home safely? Would she have rolled over along the way? I'll never know now because the storm did hit. One that seemed to come out of nowhere, barely being caught by the radar before its waves and rain started pelting the ship with the fury of an angry sea god. The seaward Sarah groaned in pain as her list worsened even more. Doors flew open, objects fell and hit me as I staggered up the hall and towards the deck. I didn't realize just how bad it had gotten until I felt my feet touch the wall and realized the wall was becoming the floor. I was still inside when I heard the call to abandon ship. I was bruised, groggy, and disoriented. Enough water had gotten in from somewhere that I was also soaked. I felt a pair of hands grab me by the shoulder and usher me forward when I stopped to take a breath. I know at some point I donned a life vest, but I couldn't tell you when or how I got it on. All I remember is the surreal sensation of the world changing directions inside the ship and the sight of tall waves illuminated by lightning once outside. Thunder drowned out the screams of my shipmates, but I could see them scrambling to launch a lifeboat. I threw myself towards them, but before I could catch a handhold, I felt a wall of ice cold water drag me into the railing. A second wave, the reaction to its action, reached over the rail and pulled me into the water.
The pain was unbearable. Not only had I been tossed around like a rag doll, but the water felt like I'd rolled into a vat of quicksand made of sharp needles. I didn't know which side was up and which was down, but thankfully the life vest lifted me back to the turbulent surface. The water had gotten into my ears, muffling the sound of the storm, and I tried to flail my arms hoping for rescue, but I couldn't lift them. I couldn't stop treading water long enough. This hell went on for longer than I care to reflect on. I just know wave after wave pulled me under, but the jacket always brought me back up long enough to catch my breath. When I close my eyes, even years later, I can still feel the unrelenting assault of the waves mingling with the taste of salt on my tongue. I was going to die, I was sure of it, either by not breathing in when I had the chance or by drowning from rainwater in my mouth whenever I screamed. And then I felt a tug, and my horror amplified tenfold as I imagined being in the jaws of a sea serpent about to pull me into the ocean depths. I thrashed desperately, trying to escape, only to hear Greta's voice chastising me. "Stop that, I'm trying to pull you in." Greta hoisted me onto the lifeboat, and once I was over the edge, I slipped the rest of the way in, landing in wet and bloody water. I could hear orders being shouted at me, but all I could do was curl up and wait, utterly useless. I know the others were preoccupied by something as they started rowing as hard as they could. In hindsight, I think they were trying to get clear of the whirlpool of the sinking ship.
The storm passed almost as quickly as it arrived. The ocean wasn't as quick to calm, but the turbulence lessened to a manageable degree. When I was finally able to, I sat up and took inventory of my surroundings. I found myself in a lifeboat with 7 other crewmates. All that was left of the Seaward Sarah were bubbles rising from the depths of the ocean. Miraculously, there was a second lifeboat paddling towards us, and once we were connected, we were overjoyed to find out that every single crew member had survived the capsizing. The captain, who was in the other raft, shouted over the water in a deep, booming voice. "We sent out a distress call before she went down. They have our coordinates. It won't be long." I hoped he was right, because my hands were trembling from the cold and the quickly depleting adrenaline. We tied the rafts together, took stock of our supplies, food, first aid, and then waited. Now, you would think that there'd be cheering when the light appeared on the horizon, that all hands would start to paddle and wave and celebrate. Instead, there was a sudden and deathly silence as a communal swell of anxiety filtered into us. There were haunted expressions on Greta and John and Sarai, and even the captain's faces. The latter was holding the flare gun, but his finger was tapping nervously on the trigger.
Sometimes, without knowing why, you get a bad feeling. People call it a sixth sense, but I think it's simpler than that. I think it's dangers perceived but baptized. I think it's dangers perceived but bypassed by the brain so you can act faster than you can think. Kind of like how you can actively analyze a person's body language to get more information than you'd get from hearing their words alone. But even if you're not trying to, you still subconsciously notice the little signs showing discomfort or anger or attraction. It's innate. What we think we perceive is only scratching the surface of all the information we truly take in. The brain, our consciousness, focuses on one thing, but our survival instinct notices the other discrepancies. And when it does, it signals danger without telling you why. "It's not moving," Greta whispered. She hit the nail on the head. She connected the dots outlining the proverbial red flag. When she did, a sort of unspoken acknowledgement traveled through the group as one by one we noticed it too. You see, there were 2 problems with the light. 1. The nearest ship to ours was at least another 5 hours away, probably longer if they hit the same storm we had. 2. The light was perfectly still, staying at the same height and never once bobbing along with the ocean surge. It also wasn't sweeping the ocean as one does when searching for survivors.
Oh, when I tell you, I just got freaking goosebumps.
Me too, and I've read this already.
Oh my god, okay. You see, it had appeared way too fast, only about half an hour after the storm had passed. It was extremely unlikely that an unknown ship had been in the area. We all try to keep tabs on one another because, in such turbulent waters, knowing where everyone is a question of life and death. Yes, technically, we're all competing against one another, but you'd be hard pressed to find any seaman unwilling to drop everything to save another in a pinch. There's a code of honor we all follow. But suppose this was an unknown vessel responding to our distress call. We still had to contend with the second issue of its unnatural immobility. My stomach contorted, wondering what it all meant. This light was fixed on a single point in the near distance. It was glowing. No, pulsating. But it never once moved on any sort of axis like it should if it was searching the water, and it was immune to the push and pull of the ocean waves. There's not a ship on Earth that can do that. The only reasonable explanation was that it might be a Coast Guard helicopter hovering perfectly in place and dangerously low. But then again, if it had been deployed the second the distress call was sent, a rescue chopper could not have gotten to us that fast.
The light was impossible. The light was menacing. The light acted like a lure, goading us to come to it. The boom of an explosion snapped me to reality, and it was followed by a crackle above. The captain had fired off one of the flares. It hung in the air, slowly fizzling in a downward arch. I remember feeling so scared I dug my fingers into the lifeboat. The shot was one thing, but my fear had to do with the light. I was so afraid it would come closer now that I for sure knew where we were. I was more afraid of that light than I have been of anything in my entire life, but thankfully it stayed away. Row, the captain ordered. No one moved, not even to breathe. Row, damn it. John, row, damn it.
Damn it.
Let's try that again. Row, damn it. John reached for the paddle, but Greta grabbed him by the forearm and stopped him, shaking her head. The captain glared at us with bulging eyes. He'd adopted an authoritative stance, but even he wasn't able to suppress his quakes of fear. If one followed logic, he was right. We should head towards the light. And yet, the longer we stared at the unwavering light, the more it unsettled us. It's funny how something as simple as bobbing up and down could have alleviated our anxiety, but the light didn't do that, not even once. Faced with a soft mutiny, the captain grumbled and grabbed a paddle of his own. Fine, he hissed. I'll go. Any man or woman too cowardly to come can transfer to the coward's raft, he gestured to us. Anyone with balls, come with me. We need to flag that ship down before it moves on without us.
Oh, I get famous last words feelings from this.
I would be front and center on the coward's boat.
100%. There's a time to do a strategic and tactical retreat from such things. The flare hit the water and spat out a few more dying embers. I was surprised to see a few crewmates get up. John and a couple others transferred over to the captain's raft. An equal number transferred to the coward's raft. With contempt on his sour, sea-worn face, the captain cut the lines between us and directed his raft to go towards the searchlight. Even as they rowed off, we pleaded with them not to go, but it was like they'd been infected with bravado. I could hear them chanting in a rhythm, left, right, until they were a blip on the horizon. 10 minutes later, the voices went quiet. At the estimated time the captain's raft would have reached the light, it suddenly blinked out of existence. The captain, John, and 5 other crewmates on that raft were never seen or heard from again. The raft has never turned up, and this despite being outfitted with an emergency tracker. Planes equipped with the same tech have gone missing as well. So it could be that those trackers aren't worth much, but it still gives me nightmares to think what would have happened to me if we'd followed the captain. As for us, it took 7 hours, but eventually we were rescued by the crew of the Rose Shannon. As expected, the storm had delayed rescue attempts. They warmed us up and combed the waters where we'd last seen the captain's raft, abandoning the search only when the Coast Guard arrived and took over. That night, I had nightmares of the light growing closer and closer, and every time its glow was about to hit me, I'd feel a pressure in my head like it was going to explode, and then a searing, burning pain on my skin. Then I'd wake up drenched in sweat.
I now work as a trucker, a mercifully landlocked job. I drive through all kinds of creepy locations. I've seen some things on this job, but nothing has ever scared me more than the light I saw on that terrible night. I don't know if it's because of the lack of closure on the captain's raft or if my subconscious saw something that it felt my brain was better off not knowing. I don't know. I don't like to think about it. But now that I've written this, I think I can finally move on in a way. I still keep in touch with Greta. She's still working out there. Props to her for getting back on that seahorse. She now captains her own vessel. I couldn't be happier for her. But sometimes, when we're catching up, she talks about that night, and she always follows it up by saying another ship's been lost in that same area. I think they're up to 5 now. No survivors, although the final transmission of one of the ships mentioned seeing a light on the horizon. Sailors have come to avoid what they're calling the Alaska Triangle. Part of me wishes I knew conclusively what's happening out there, but mostly I'm glad I'm here on solid ground, far from the light.
Wow, that was fucking fantastic.
Amazing writing, seriously.
Oh my god, I love that. I absolutely adore that. 10 out of 10. I'm looking forward to reading more stories from Manon because that was fabulous.
Our third story, our last one today, is also one by Manon, so I think you're gonna really like that one too.
Ooh, I'm very excited. Okay, fabulous.
And those of you listening, if you did enjoy that story, go show Manon all of the love. We are going to be, like I said, posting the link to the story in the description. So make sure you check it out. Send some of that grim curriculum love their way and tell them how much you loved it because I'm covered in goosebumps.
Oh, it amazing. It had all the elements of a story to draw you in. The writing was fantastic. Wonderful.
Our second story comes from Reddit user M59Gar. It was posted on No Sleep, and this post is titled, I learned a new skill and it cost me everything.
I only signed up for the experimental education program because I was desperate. I'd been out of a job for 4 months and I had no savings left. I was going to be homeless in a matter of weeks, so I started lying on my resume. I put whatever I thought companies wanted to see. Eventually, I scored an interview, and they actually gave me the job after I confidently walked in and bullshitted my way through. A handshake sealed the deal. I would be making 200 grand a year working with peptides. The only problem? I was due to start in 2 days, and I had no idea what peptides even were, let alone how to work with them. My whole life was about to implode, so naturally, I sat around drinking beer and scrolling the internet all Saturday night. It was there that I saw a sidebar ad for the experimental education program. They claimed that using virtual reality, I could learn a new skill in under 3 minutes. Not just a new skill, but any skill, regardless of complexity. Right? Impossible, sure. Drunkenly, I responded to the ad with an email asking if I could learn molecular biology in under 3 minutes.
It was 2 a.m. on a Saturday night, but I received an immediate response from a Dr. Jensen claiming that, yes, this was possible. Right, sure. Rolling my eyes, I signed up for one of their prototype trials the following morning. I awoke hungover that Sunday morning to an alarm that my past self had set. It read, Learn molecular biology, 12:15. God, really? Well, I had nothing to lose, so I dragged myself out of bed, showered in a funk, and drove out to the offices of experimental education. Parking outside that nondescript office building near downtown, I remained ready to bolt at the first sign of a multi level marketing scam. The parking lot was astonishingly solitary and lonely under that gray, drizzling overcast, which I took paradoxically as a good sign. If there'd been dozens of other people heading in, then we were all probably marked for some PowerPoint pitch. As I approached, a bespectacled older man in a white lab coat stepped out of the automatic glass doors. Through his medical mask, he said, You're late. I looked at my cell phone. It's 12:16.
The process only takes 3 minutes, he chided me. That would have been a third of another appointment if we were fully booked. Oh shit, sorry. I awkwardly followed him into the building without further protest. The halls within were standard Art Deco and had definitely been rented by his team rather than built for this purpose. I might have even been there before for something else years ago. It was impossible to tell. He showed me through a door where an office full of medical equipment waited next to two impatient nurses. They were both wearing masks, just like the doctor, but I was not. I reached into my pockets, pretending to look for a mask, but they ignored my attempt to save face. One nurse guided me to the central chair, while the other prepared a syringe of neon green liquid. It was the doctor himself who handed me a clipboard with several sheets of paper on it. I briefly scanned it, noticing some medical terms and molecular biology written in cursive halfway, but he shoved a red pen in my hand. I asked, Is this the waiver? It's the contract, he said flatly. You're already late. Please just sign it. Both nurses stopped and stared at me. Feeling intensely pressured, I awkwardly wrote my signature in red at the bottom and handed it back to him.
He stashed the clipboard, then returned with a helmet that looked straight out of a science fiction B movie. Confused by its colorful lights and exposed technological hardware, I asked, "Is that the virtual reality helmet?" As he slid it on over my head, he said, "No Matrix jokes, please." My senses went black as the helmet covered my eyes, ears, and nose. "Where are the controls?" Nobody answered me. Instead, I felt a jab in my arm. I could only figure that the nurse was injecting me with that neon green liquid, but it was too late to ask why. A white light appeared in my vision, first as an intense dot, but then expanding into an all encompassing flare that simultaneously numbed me and made me feel like I was rising out of my body. Heat needled every inch of me, and then I sat up. I was in a white walled room only slightly bigger than my college dorm room back in the day. The bed underneath me was thin and uncomfortable. Had something gone wrong? Had they brought me somewhere else to recover? I shakily stood, finding myself clothed in a basic white shirt and basic white pants. Both were thin, like hospital gown material. A nearby sink was made of white porcelain, and I walked over to it. No mirror. I think that was what first tipped me off. Mirrors were a processing cost that most games weren't willing to pay, and it was even harder in virtual reality where coders could never guess what the protagonists looked like in real life. The next thing that tipped me off, there was no door. There was no actual way to enter or leave the white walled room. The only thing present was a white table stacked with books. Out loud, I said, "Holy crap, am I in virtual reality right now?" My voice sounded normal. My hands and arms seemed to be my own. My legs even ached a little. If this was virtual reality, it was insanely good. I actually felt like myself just cast into the new environment. Maybe the injection had been some sort of hallucinogen. Maybe the helmet's visuals weren't really that good, but I was perceiving them as realistic. If that was the case, then learning a new skill might be difficult.
I approached the table and sat in the only other furniture in the room, which was, of course, a white chair. The books were all thick texts pertaining to molecular biology. Okay, then. This is what I'd signed up for, this is what I'd needed, and it looked like it was really happening. Opening the first book, I started reading. It was heady and complex stuff that tired my brain quickly. After about half a chapter, I sighed, looked around, and decided to take a break. Screw it. Nap time. I awoke in a blink, feeling as if I'd never slept at all. That wasn't good. I returned to my textbook and made it through to the end of the first chapter. Okay, now I vaguely knew how a cell worked. I was feeling better, actually, which I chalked up to my hangover fading. I continued on through another chapter before breaking from the textbook with bleary eyes. Time to eat. I stood and looked around. No food. Simulating hunger was a new thing I'd never expected, and I was honestly wondering why they'd programmed that in without providing any food. I turned on the sink, but the water that came out was black and stank of rotten eggs. Mortified, I shook my head and backed away. I reclined on the bed and slept again, but woke up with a start, feeling like only a split second had passed. The only indicator that time had passed was that the rotten egg smell had faded. I was still hungry and tired.
As great as the simulation was, it was terrible in certain very fundamental ways. Maybe that was up to me to point out when I give feedback. After all, this was a prototype. I returned to my textbooks, pushing through, learning what I could until my hunger, thirst, and tiredness became too distracting. They'd created something amazing here, and I was indeed learning molecular biology, but was I supposed to read this entire stack of textbooks while starving, parched, and sleep deprived? I needed to do this for my new job, so I kept at it, forcing myself to focus. I actually finished reading and understanding the first entire textbook before the screaming inside my body became too overwhelming to continue. Maybe the information from the single textbook I'd read would be enough to fake my way through a Monday morning. I had to give up. Standing, I tried to speak. Instead, I coughed. I hadn't spoken in how long? I couldn't tell. A few more coughs, I said weakly, "I'd like to leave now." Nothing happened. End the simultation. Still nothing. Okay, computer, freeze program? Nope. I shouted, "Existence is paused." Just silence and white. The long shot quote had failed. My heart hammered painfully in my chest as I began to realize there was no way out. I'd entered this experiment to learn molecular biology, and that's what I was going to have to do.
As I sat and forced myself to read, I started fearing a time limit. My body was slowly but surely getting weaker and shrinking from starvation. The hunger burned, making me aware of the very engine of life inside myself as it consumed calories. I wasn't dying because this wasn't real, but the thirst was driving me mad. I turned on the sink a few times, desperate to drink the black water that stank of rotten eggs, but I couldn't make myself do it, even in the darkest depths of my agony. Sleep was pointless. I became a husk. I sat, I studied textbooks, and I flipped pages slowly with emaciated fingers. That was all I was for what felt like months. It wasn't enough to read the textbooks, I had to understand them too. Learning while mostly insane from hunger and thirst and insomnia felt like a monumental task. I was certain that I was never going to escape. The program would never end. This would be it for me forever. I spent an entire week screaming, but to no avail. I raged at the walls, chipping away at them, just uncovering more white plaster. I was perpetually dying, but never actually ceasing to exist. I broke the sink, and the black, rotten egg water spewed onto the floor, and then down a hard to see white drain. I sat in the stench, my feet wet, and continued to learn. What other choice did I have? This was never going to end. I flipped through the pages for eternity, truly giving up on the concept of escaping, right up until I closed the final book. When the helmet lifted away and I found myself in that room with two nurses and the doctor again, I sat in a disbelieving daze. The doctor asked, "How was it?"
I stared down. My hands were normal again. My arms had their former strength. I touched my face, finding that I was not a husk. Wide eyed, I fixated on the question. It was horrible. I was starving and thirsty and tired the entire time. He nodded. That's a manifestation of the cost of thinking so rapidly. You just experienced 7 months of intense thought and learning in 3 minutes. He nodded at the empty syringe in the nurse's hand. That liquid we injected you with contained concentrated neurochemicals, electrolytes, vitamins, and the like. We were hoping it would lessen the pain involved. I grabbed his arm. It was the worst thing I've ever been through. Yes, but did you learn molecular biology like you wanted? Thinking it through, I realized I had. Then it's a success. All that's left is refining the technology. I let go of his arm and grimaced apologetically. Rising shakily, I wandered for the door. They didn't even lead me towards the front of the building. The three just went about their business, readying the room for the next subject. I wasn't even sure how I got home. I just lay there all evening and all night, staring into the ceiling as intense trauma rushed around the edges of my awareness. When my alarm went off to wake me up for my first day of work, I was still just laying there with open eyes. But I did know molecular biology.
I love how the doctor was basically like, "Yeah, but did you die?" Poor man's like, "I kind of wanted to."
Right? Like, I wish I did.
Oh my goodness. I was already dressed. I just dragged myself up, drove to my new office, and floated through my first day at my new job. They gave me some training, and I actually understood the science. What I didn't understand was how experimental education's technology was even possible. The naive young version of me that had gone into that machine would never have questioned the fundamental technologies at play, but they just forcefully taught me everything I needed to know. All day long, instead of doing my job, I thought about just how powerful that neon green liquid would have had to been to do what they claimed. The brain was the most expensive engine in the human body, and running it for 7 months would require far more than a syringe, no matter how densely packed the contents. That night, I remained awake, still staring at the ceiling. I hadn't slept in 7 months, so closing my eyes and trying to do it still felt unnatural. The nightmare I'd gone through felt simultaneously like an eternity and a mere instant. I just kept coming back to the same question: how? I tried to ignore that persistent question, and I did manage to take some fitful naps filled with flashback sensations to that white walled room, but I only made it 2 more days before I couldn't take it any longer.
That Wednesday night, I drove back to that office long after it had closed. The front door was locked, but the signs for experimental education were still up. Returning to my car and fetching a tire iron and a bag, I carefully crept around the corner, along the shadowed side of the building, and toward the back. There, in the darkest and quietest corner of the alley, I found a low window that would serve. Was I really going to do this? I had to know. The tire iron shattered the window with just a light tap. I winced. Somewhere a dog barked. I waited, but nobody human seemed to have noticed the sound of falling glass. Steeling my resolve, I carefully lowered myself into the basement. In the dark, I felt my way past stacked chairs, tables, and other generic office equipment. Nearing the dim light of the stairwell, I felt something soft, warm, and wet. It was fabric, but it was a person.
He groaned, and I hurriedly backed up. Standing there in the dark, I waited, terrified. I was busted for sure. Someone had found me, right? When he didn't say anything, I sensed that something was wrong in a very different way than I'd expected. Moving further, I found a light switch and then turned around to look. A tan skinned man of vaguely Middle Eastern appearance was hanging by both arms from two thick chains embedded in the ceiling. He was wearing a black business suit that had been sullied by assault, and long trails of blood, both dried and fresh, ran from his head, ears, and neck. It was immediately obvious that someone had beaten this man half to death and then chained him here in the basement of this office building, but knowing that only made me even more frightened. He blinked awake, and his eyes settled on me. I would have expected him to seem hopeful, but his gaze only held defeated apathy. Noticing his silence, I moved forward and pulled a bald cloth from inside his mouth. He spit blood and then looked at me with sullen askance. I prompted, do you need help? I couldn't place his accent. He said simply, "Release me." "Yeah, of course," I said quickly. "I'll go get help." "No," he responded wearily. "Sorry, what? You don't want me to get the police?" "You have to make the choice to release me yourself." I hesitated. What the hell does that mean?
Of all the responses he could have given, I didn't expect a laugh. His tired snicker echoed throughout the basement, setting me on edge. There was something very, very wrong here, something very, very wrong with him. I had no idea what his relation to experimental education, if he even had one, but I backed away with an increasing urge to run. He just stared at me, never blinking. I found the stairwell and stumbled my way up, keeping my eyes on him as long as I could. When I finally closed the stairwell door quietly behind me, a palpable, primal fear drained out of me. Something about that chained man had frightened me in a way that was deeper than logic and deeper than mere emotion. After I was done here, I was going to call the police, and I was never going near him again. I moved through the dark hallway lit by red exit signs until I found the room I remembered. The equipment was all still inside, and after waiting and listening for another few minutes, I dared enter and turn on the lights. Quickly, I moved to the biohazard container. A whole pile of used syringes lay within, and I could see neon green glimmering in most of them. I picked out a handful and threw them in my bag. I could take them to someone for analysis later. Next, I found a stack of waivers. No, not waivers. They were contracts, exactly as the doctor had said. They were written in odd, archaic legalese, and while I could recognize some language pertaining to learning skills and to amenities provided that mentioned a bed, a table, and a sink, the rest made no sense. What the hell was I reading? Why had I been asked to sign this?
Stuffing them into my bag as well, I moved on to the crown jewel of the room, the virtual reality helmet. Lifting it high, I examined it closely. I looked for cords, but there were none. I opened the back panel, but it only contained a few batteries to power the lights on the outside. Prying at a bit of the outer hardware, I popped off some of the pieces that looked like computer chips. They weren't connected to anything. None of it was connected to anything. The helmet, the goggles, the ear covers, it was all fake. It was nothing. The helmet looked like a B movie prop because it was. Then what the hell had I experienced? I had absolutely gone somewhere. I had spent 7 months starving and thirsting and sleepless. I'd learned an entire field of study in 3 minutes. Or had I just imagined it all as some part of mental experience? Of course, it wasn't virtual reality at all. It had to be some sort of new superdrug. The neon green liquid would hold the answer. Clutching my bag, I readied myself to escape the building, which meant another encounter with the man in the basement. I stepped quietly down the stairwell, but he already knew I was there. He watched me with icy eyes as I passed. I paused below the window, wondering if I could really just leave him here. He said, with genuine hate, "Your suffering will be legendary." I turned, locking eyes with him.
His anger turned slowly into an understanding grin. Oh my, it already was, wasn't it? His mocking laugh followed me as I climbed out the window and ran for my car. I didn't call the police. Something about him had been far too strange. I just stayed home for the rest of that night, catching what nightmare filled sleep I could, and then brought some of that neon green liquid to a coworker the next day for analysis. Then I did my best to get on with my life. My sleep was tortured, I was constantly on edge, and I was fearful at random times, but I finally had a job. My landlord was coming around to ask for rent. I told him I'd found a position and was about to get paid, but he reminded me that I was already extremely behind and very close to eviction. No problem, it was almost payday. Except, when payday came the next week, I opened my paycheck to find a statement for $0. Of course, I went to see my boss, who looked at me with confusion. He said, "Didn't you read your hiring contract? Training is unpaid and you're training for the first month." I had not read that, no. I tried to argue, but he dismissed me. I went home with a gnawing sense that my life was about to implode. When I faced my landlord and told him it'd be another few weeks, he grew angry and told me I was done. I argued that he couldn't do that, but he told me to read my lease and he took my key right from my hand.
What else could I do? I wandered onto the street and found a bench to sit on. I had no money and nowhere to go. How the hell could this have happened to me? I'd always tried to work hard and do my best, but now I was sitting on a park bench, homeless. The world seemed to know somehow. Every dog that passed barked at me as if it was afraid. I got up and tried to go to a church for charity, but the door wouldn't open for me. Strangers seemed to get chills if I stood too close to them. I simply felt wrong, and somehow I wanted to blame it all on experimental education. It didn't take many days like that for my boss to fire me. When I asked why, he said, "No, your work is fine. You just smell. And you look like shit. You come off as a homeless guy." "I am homeless because you're not paying me, asshole," I shot back, finally snapping. "Why should I pay you?" he asked. "I'll just keep getting free months off people since they can learn the skill to do this job in 3 minutes, just like you. You're completely replaceable." He made a noise of disgust and then stalked off, threatening to call security if I wasn't out in 10 minutes. He knew about experimental education. He knew I'd gone. How? I gathered my few things in a box, wondering how my life had come apart so forcefully. On my way out of the building, my coworker stopped me. "Hey man, you know that green stuff you gave me? I took a look at it." "It doesn't matter anymore," I told him, too overwhelmed to care. He briefly gripped the edge of the box. "You should be careful with that stuff. It's lethal." I froze. "Lethal? They use those chemicals in executions," he insisted. Pulling my box away from him, I shook my head. "I was injected with that. I'm still alive." No way. This stuff induces brain death almost immediately. You'd need to have a counter injection in like 3 minutes or less, or you're not coming back. What? 3 minutes?
That knocked me out of my darkness. I told him I'd be careful. Then I hurried to my car. Something was snapping into place for me. Experimental education hadn't been using virtual reality at all. The truth was far darker and more twisted than I could have ever guessed. I drove back to their office building and waited until I saw the doctor and the nurses leave. The back window had been hastily patched with wood, but I removed it with my tire iron. Then I slipped inside. The strange and frightening man was still chained within. His head was leaking fresh blood from a recent wound, but he was smiling as I approached. I held my contract in my hand. I read it. Good, he said with a grin. What did you learn? Now that I finally understand what they're actually doing, the archaic language makes sense, I told him. They're killing people. They killed me, at least for a little while. Then they brought me back with a counter injection. But I signed a contract for the experience I would have while dead. I pointed at his head wound. The red pen. It was filled with your blood, wasn't it? His grin widened into a smirk. You're beginning to understand. Those assholes, I replied, filled with equal parts admiration, disgust, awe, and hopelessness. They actually managed to commoditize the human afterlife. They actually managed to turn hell into a product. Just another way to make us more expendable. He nodded, his eyes filled with animal fire. If I free you, I said slowly, the same fire raging inside me, what will you do? I'll kill them, he replied, genuine in his anger. Then I'll kill their masters, right up the chain until I reach the true monsters. I will topple this world one brutally torturous murder at a time. I will burn it down and sink humanity into a lawless cage of darkness. I didn't need to look for the key to his chains. In a sense, I already had it. I touched my contract to the metal links and they rusted away. All I had to say was, good.
Ooh, I feel like that man in chains was the devil,
Oh, I like that.
right? They managed to somehow trap him, getting him to do sort of their dirty work, but now he's free. I really like that.
That was a really, really interesting concept. I like that one a lot.
I did too. It definitely took some turns I was not expecting. And so kudos for that. That was very unique. I like it.
All right, so we have another one from Man in Lyset. This is another one on No Sleep, and the post is titled, I house a rescue dog with a high success rate at finding mauled bodies.
I woke up this morning to a stinky hot breath in my nose and a dollop of saliva on my cheek. I opened my eyes, and Major was staring down at me with such intensity it could only mean one thing. He wanted to play. I could see his mouth opening as though to protest the refusal he surely knew was coming. It was only 2 a.m. after all, but we were spared the back and forth when my phone dinged to life. Major jumped off of me and barked at it with excitement. A phone call at that hour, unfortunately, was nothing to get excited over. My brain was still foggy from waking up, so I can't recall the exact wording, but the gist of it was that they needed my, and more importantly, Major's help finding a missing hiker. Major, for all his faults and reeking farts, was one of the best damn rescue dogs you'll ever meet. He has a keen sense for the mountain and has an amazing track record at finding lost hikers, even when their trails have gone cold.
I guess you win, boy, I mumbled as I got up and got dressed for work. I grabbed a cup of coffee on the way to the ranger station and tracked down the chief, who was looking at a gridded map and directing the search crews. There was a steady stream of orange jackets and headlamps walking to and away from him. There were also multiple canine units. Major was the only dog off leash, and there was good reason for that. Like I said before, he's great at what he does, but he has his faults. He tends to slip out of his collar and go off running on his own. Having worked with him for at least a few years now, I found the most successful way of dealing with him is letting him do his thing. He breaks from the pack, somehow finds the missing person, then runs back to me and leads me back to them, Lassie style. The chief turned towards me. This is what I recall of the conversation. Dylan, Major, good you're here. We have a hiking boot for you to sniff. This wasn't the time for humor, but I couldn't help myself. Me or the dog? I thought I was hilarious, but the chief gave me the look. He handed me the boot and I crouched down to Major's level, holding it out to him to give it a good sniff. The boot was a spare they'd found in her car, but the scent was still strong enough for Major to track. We're looking for Rhonda James. She and her friends were supposed to go up to the Pinewood Trail to see the sunset last night. They got separated. The girls found their way back to the station about an hour ago, but there'd been no trace of Rhonda. My stomach churned with dread. We should have closed the Pinewood Trail years ago. It's well marked and the forest isn't too dense in that area, but somehow every few months people go missing. Most are found safe and sound before the search is even in full swing, but occasionally, Major and I come across badly mauled remains. The working theory is that it's a cougar, but no one's been able to find its den, let alone its tracks. Either way, I hope we find Rhonda before it, whatever it was, did.
Major was eager to go. So eager, in fact, that he didn't even wait for my signal. I looked away for 1 second and he was running off towards the bushes, tail wagging frantically. If that damn dog wasn't so good at his job, I swear no one would put up with him. I sighed, knowing there was no catching him. Thankfully, he had an almost supernatural ability to find people and make his way back to me. So I figured I'd see him trotting up sooner or later. I went off towards the Pinewood Trail with a pair of rangers. I didn't like the Pinewood Trail by dark. There was something eerie about it I couldn't quite put my fingers on. You would think there'd be comfort in the sparsity of the trees, but it had the opposite effect. To me, it's easier to imagine someone or something peeking out from behind the trees when they're not as dense. I feel watched. I hear things that I shouldn't normally hear. I see figures, then look to only find a junior tree. Thicker parts of the mountain feel safer, like hunkering down behind a tall fence. Come to think of it, maybe it's because there's nowhere for me to hide. Rhonda James! Shouted Alana. Hers wasn't the only voice calling for the missing hiker. Other rescuers called too, their voices bouncing off the thin tree line like pinballs. We walked around for about an hour, periodically calling Rhonda's name before something happened. Something that chilled me to the bone. It was a wail, feminine but unnatural. It screeched with intensity, piercing through the mountainside with its haunting sharpness. That might be a cougar, Alana whispered. We looked at her, and I could see the other ranger, Parker, reaching for his rifle. I could feel the anxiousness in the air coming from all three of us. Do you think it's. I started? Parker interrupted. We have to go. Might not be too late.
The assumption was that wherever the cougar was, its victim must be nearby. If she was lucky, she'd only been dragged around. If she wasn't, well, maybe we could still save her. Maybe she hadn't bled out yet. I don't know. In any case, we took off running in the direction of the shrieking and radioed to other teams to try and triangulate the location until the shrieking came to a sudden, sobering stop. Was it too late? Only time would tell. About half an hour, the trees began to thicken, indicating we were leaving the Pinewood area. Much to my relief, I could see distant spots of light every so often from other teams, combing farther and higher up the mountain. I wondered if they saw us too. I lost track of time, but I think it was about another hour had passed in silence, and we were starting to think we'd veered off course or something. And then I heard footsteps behind me and froze. Parker and Alana stopped as well. Parker reached for his gun again, while Alana seemed to reach for her flares. My heart thrashed. Truth be told, I'm not sure who wins in a fight between three people and a cougar. I have a sneaking suspicion it's the cougar. I turned, slowly holding my breath as though a single inhale would have been the tipping point between life and getting mauled in the face. And when I saw two glowing eyes looking back at me, glowing in the way animal eyes reflect light in the dark, I just about blacked out. There was something massive prowling in the bushes, looking at us. Shoot it, Alana hissed. I don't see it, stammered Parker.
I tried to point at it, but before my arm lifted, it jumped out of the bushes, and I saw the rapid batting of an enthusiastic tail. Major, you scared the shit out of us. Major barked and ran over. He was met with relieved chuckles and head pats. And then the disobedient rascal signaled he'd found something. My chest tightened, and I hoped to every god I could think of that Rhonda was still alive. She was not. We found her soon afterwards in a brutal scene of animalesque gore. She hadn't stood a chance. I think she fought because some of her nails were broken and there was a large canine embedded in her cheek. Worse yet, she was still a little warm. If any of us had found her a bit sooner, she would have been fine. I quietly wondered whether Major had been with her in her final moments. She was brought out of the woods on a stretcher and sent to the medical examiner. Major and I returned home. He seemed happy as ever, not fully grasping the concept of death, I thought. I was heartbroken. I got myself some whiskey and collapsed back into bed, with Major at my side. And then my phone rang. As I rubbed Major's face, I heard the chief explain the tooth they'd found on Rhonda James didn't belong to a cougar. They suspect a wolf or big dog of some sort, and suddenly I felt the ground fall beneath me. As I played with Major, I lifted his gums a tad bit, just enough to see an empty spot where one of his canines should have been, and I suddenly thought back to the intense look he'd given me that morning, the saliva on my face, the way he always finds the bodies first, always mauled to death, and how we always arrive just a bit too late. Oh my god.
Oh my God.
I kind of felt where that was going. I was like, "Oh no, I hope to God it's not the dog."
Bad doggy.
Oh, I like it. You know what? 3 absolutely wonderful scary stories. I loved each and every one of them for very different reasons. Well done to those wonderful authors.
And again, I know I said it before, but we're going to share the links to their work. Please show them all the love. They're so talented, and I'm so grateful that we got to share these stories because they need to be heard. They're amazing, and getting to narrate them was a blast.
No kidding. We hope you guys really enjoyed them as much as we did. And if you did, please, of course, check out Grim Encounters 1 through 4. We like to do one of these about every 4 to 5 months. So if you do have an experience or a story you'd like featured on the next one, please email them to us at thegrimcurriculum@gmail.com.
And as always, if you like this episode, please give us a thumbs up or 5-star rating, depending on where you're listening, because it really does. It goes a long way. It helps us big time.
It sure does.
Like we mentioned, we are nearing our 100th episode. So next week, you guys are getting a fun little historic palate cleanser. And then we're getting real dark.
Real dark. It's going to be a good series, but I'm also bracing myself for the imminent trauma, even though we're both very familiar with this particular case.
I think a lot of people are. It's someone who is very well known. And I'm excited for our take on his story.
And now, of course, we have come to that time in the episode where we thank our gorgeous, splendiferous patrons over on Patreon. Dina, take it away.
Thank you very much to Kevinus Musicus, Judy, Hillary, Mayhem Mudkip, Lisa, Brian, Atlantean Jedi, and of course, Bob. Thank you so much. If you want to be featured on this glorious list or you want access to some super fun behind the scenes content, check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/thegrimcurriculum. Lots of fun stuff on there. So give it a looky-loo if you feel like.
Absolutely. And as always, you can find us on the various platforms across the interwebs. We are on, of course, Facebook, Twitter, or X.
Hey, you know what, though? I have to say, Charlotte, Facebook and Instagram went down yesterday, and I was panicking, and I was really glad that X was there to tell me that it was down, and I wasn't just getting hacked.
Luckily, at work, social media is something I work quite closely with, and so immediately we were pretty aware of what was going on. Oh, yes. But when they are up and running, we're on Facebook, Instagram, X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it, Elon's scary platform. We're also on Etsy and Threadless if you'd like to check out some of our merch.
And don't forget that TikTok.
Oh, yeah. I even forget about the TikTok. We are there. I try to share things from time to time, and we upload little teasers to our episodes. So go check that out too if you're not already following over there. Thank you all so much for listening. This has been The
The
Grim
Grim Curriculum.
Curriculum.
All right, Charlotte, I want to talk to you about sharks.
Ooh, I do love sharks.
I'm sure you're well aware that sharks are one of the oldest species on the planet, but did you know how old? First of all, they existed before trees.
Holy shit, that is a mind blowing fact.
Sharks first evolved 450 million years ago, and to put it in perspective, the rings on Saturn are 100 million years old. Polaris, aka, of course, the North Star, formed approximately 70 million years ago. So sharks, real old.
I mean, when those days arrive when I'm feeling old as fuck, I'll just think to myself, well, I haven't been around as long as a shark has.
Bye.
Bye.